Hello to you all. I'm overwhelmed. It's been a difficult month, personally and work-wise. I lost a sister not that long ago. And so I ask of myself some compassion. And I hope what I have to say this evening helps. The first thing I'd like to do is just pour a small libation. Usually we use alcohol, but acknowledging of indigenous brothers and sisters, I'll just use a little bit of water to acknowledge our ancestors. And what I want to start with first is thank yous to Kike for inviting me to be a part of this. I knew Kike's father, the legendary Charles Roach, as a stalwart activist in the Black community. I knew her and her sisters as children. I knew her mother. I interviewed as a young lawyer for a position in his office. I don't know if he offered me the job, you know. I know he talked a lot. And those of you who know Charles know that that is a signature mark. I set up practice with another Black woman, Marva Jemmett. In fact, we had the first Black women's law firm in Canada, but we didn't brand ourselves that way. There was one other woman before us, another Black woman who had been a lawyer. So we were 3 in the city. And then another woman, Susan Alves, joined us, and then the partnership split up. So, you know, her approaching me to do this is the closing of a very poignant circle. I thank you all for taking the time to attend to hear me. I am really overwhelmed. And I thank Anthony Morgan and Vicky Mochama for agreeing to be part of the presentation. And I want to give shout-outs to all my family and friends in the audience. I won't mention by name, because I know I'll leave someone out. You all know who you are, and so I thank you. I am deeply honored. I also want to hold in my mind, and I hope you do too, the tragedy that occurred in Somalia last week. I want to keep in mind those islands of the Caribbean which were ravaged by the hurricanes, and in particular Puerto Rico, American in nationality, but very much a part of the Caribbean. And I want to acknowledge the ongoing struggle of the indigenous people of Turtle Island for their rightful place on this land. I don't know how many of you know that Mandela's clan name was Madiba. I'm sure some of you know that. It came from a chief who ruled in the 18th century, and many refer to him by that name. And some of you may know also that Mandela was unable to shed tears because his tear ducts had been blocked by the limestone dust when he was imprisoned and made to work in a limestone mine. So this is a very simple poem I wrote over the last couple of days. A conversation with Madiba. Madiba, they say you cannot shed tears because you cried all the tears of the world. Why then do the mothers cry in Burma, Myanmar, and Somalia? The fathers and brothers, the sisters in Syria, the children in Chicago and Congo, the children of war, sisters of brothers and brothers of sisters. Why, Madiba, if you shed all the tears of the world? Ah, Madiba, I only play with you because I know it was limestone dust that stopped your tears, where they held you prisoner, that stopped your crying. But I have a question, Madiba, I need you to think about. What happens to all the unshed tears of the world? Where do they go? The tears of my sisters and my sisters' sisters, the tears of Winnie, of your children, of the brothers and the brothers' brothers. Madiba, what does a tear that is not shed look like? Do they collect within great, still pools of mourning for those lost long, long ago and today, but still with us, for ourselves and others whom we have othered and who have othered us and themselves? Madiba, if the tear is not shed, is it still a tear? Can we cry invisible tears, Madiba? There are so many tears we need to shed, Madiba, and have shed for us. So many that some will remain unshed. Will we uncry with you, Madiba, the unshed tears that you and we have gathered? For we must cry for that which should never have happened and which should not be happening. But we will also cry, Madiba, for joy, for every step we have taken and take to that place where no one loses their tears because of limestone dust. To those who are recording, am I standing close enough or too far away from the mic? I want to start with an image of a woman in a darkened room at night on a tiny island. It is before the time of electricity, so there is a lit lamp on a dining table, around which sit 3 small children. The woman pours a drink called cocoa tea from cup to cup. For the first pour, the cups are held close together. For the second pour, the cup from which the liquid is poured into the other cup is held high up. The children are transfixed by the activity, mesmerizing, almost hypnotic in its rhythm. This is how you cool cocoa tea. That woman was my mother, and the children, me, and 2 of my siblings. Something was being created by these small ritualistic acts that were probably taking place in every home on the island, Tobago. She, my mother, was cooling cocoa tea, but she was also creating a pool of love lit by lamplight. And that love would ripple out to family, to the island of my birth, Tobago, that now held us in its soft evening blackness, and to the Caribbean, that beautiful and cruel necklace of islands, stepping stones of volcanic and coral rocks between North and South America, and finally to Canada, or as we know it, Turtle Island. I believe that those early lessons in love of family, love of place, love of land is what allows me to love other places. Further, those early lessons learned in the Caribbean and learned often from the Caribbean would hold me and many like me, many of you here today, no doubt, or your parents, in good stead. Our cardboard grips, as we call them, filled with dreams, ambitions, and hard-edged hope. Those undergirded us, allowing us to come to places like Canada, the USA, and Great Britain, not to mention places like Panama and Cuba, but places like the White North, places inherently hostile to us as Black people and inimical to our well-being. It allowed us to challenge the laws and social mores that would hold us as inferior, the classic hewers of wood and drawers of water. A small quote from a poem I wrote many, many years ago. It remains unpublished. Those of us who grasp the hallowed of brown cardboard grips filled with winter vests black cheeks ruddy with never-seen frost, twisty and twirly, GCE passports, clothing pinned to notes, notes pinned to heads filled with blackies tropical, going abroad, big country ambition, thermogene, tiger balm, and soft candle. Rub down well at night, you see, and make something of yourself. Remember the soles of your feet, and don't take cold. What did we take with us but the desire to leave? Oh, graved islands of grief-black women and memory, if places could grieve. There is another image, that of my father who, in another small town at a later time, would every evening bring light to the house by slowly pumping the gas lamp. The small net bag behind the glass chimney glowing white as it illuminated the entire room. That would be another metaphor, the metaphor of lighting the world around us, that would help me to see the role I and many like me would play as we left our islands of birth, creating yet another exodus, this time apparently voluntary, but all part of that original forced transportation, terror-filled exile from Africa. And we carried that love with us. Love of home, love of family, love of language, albeit a forced language, but one which we had made our own. In Lukshide and Mama Loka Boo Boo. It went like, Mama Loka Boo Boo. Love of laughter, and last but perhaps most importantly, love of freedom, which we were willing and prepared to struggle for wherever we landed. There's a poem I wrote some years ago during the Rhodesia War liberation. The title is Jongwe. It was the symbol of the ZANU-PF party. And Jongwe in Shona means the cock or cockerel. Just a short section from it. And I talk about two drums, the don-don and the gongo. They're talking drums. The don-don weaves. We had one dream, a rhythm freedom would gift. The gongo, it could not, replies. We had two dreams, the don-don weaves the rhythm, yesterday, not one more shall die. The gongo replies, many and one salted the Atlantic. The don-don weaves three dreams, a rhythm we had tomorrow, we would return before. The gongon replies, before we sowed the new world with the seed of difference to harvest a strangeness beyond. The don weaves redemption, to labor 7 years, the gongon replies, in the cane fields of the soul. The don weaves the rhythm, will you die for freedom? Did you die for truth? The gongon replies, whose truth, whose freedom? Today, the don weaves a rhythm, was the year of the cockerel. The gongon replies, Yongwe. And make no mistake, in the face of a long legacy of enslaved peoples, as people who were terrorized, brutalized, and murdered with impunity, and then excluded from the rights and benefits of society, love, any kind of love, I'm tempted to say, in the face of that, is a deep and abiding act of resistance. To love, to cling to a land that has been the source of such biblical tribulation is a miraculous act. Have we been historically traumatized? Most certainly. Do we live in a context described as post-traumatic slave syndrome? A phrase coined by Dr. Joy Degree? Yes. Are too many of our communities riven by crime? Do we from cradle to grave suffer the ordinary and not so ordinary acts of anti-Black racism that result in dropouts and underachievers? Are we over-policed and underserved? Are too many of our children streamed into non-academic streams? Are too many of us caught up in what is referred to as the justice system? Are too many of our LGBTQ communities underserved and discriminated against? Yes to every one of those questions. It is therefore all the more remarkable that we continue to express astonishing acts of love, compassion, accomplishments, and achievement. That we continue to live lives of honor, dignity, raising children in a city where daycare is essentially unaffordable, and reasonably priced rental housing scarce, where home ownership is beyond the dreams of too many. We, African Canadians, as we are called, African descended people resident here, and that includes for me the many, many who may be without status, those who have come from the continent as well, as we refer. Those who have come from the continent, as we refer to Africa, Muslims, Christians, and those who follow more traditional spiritual ways of honoring the world and the Creator, however we may wish to describe that relationship with something larger than us. Those who have come from the Caribbean, and last but not least, those African Canadians who have been here for many, many generations. And I want to acknowledge today that I think a few days ago, African Nova Scotians, African Canadian Nova Scotians, got the news that they can get the deeds to their land. And my apologies for being too close to the mic. We, the Afro Spark, as I call the scattering of Africans around the world, or diasporic communities, continue to struggle to bring changes, to demand changes in societies like this one, changes which have humanized this city, and therefore this province and country in ways too many to list. At this point, I just want to go to the opening essay in a blank called Jamming Still, and I have some excerpts from there. I write memory on the margins of history in the shadow of empire and on the frontier of silence. I write against the grain as an unembedded, disappeared poet and writer in Canada. I write from a place of multiple identities, Black, African-descended, female, immigrant or interloper, and Caribbean, which often, by their very nature, generate hostilities within the body politic of a so-called multicultural nation. And what better place to write an introduction to this work than Tobago, the island of my birth, to which I have been making annual pilgrimages for the last 35 years. It was here, little more than a quarter of a century ago, I wrote Echoes in a Stranger Land, the introduction to my first collection of essays, Frontiers, essays and writings on racism and culture. The title Frontiers was a play on one of its meanings, margin, whose connotation within social context often suggests a sense of being overlooked. The frontier, however, despite its historical links with colonial discourse, suggested to me a place where anything was possible, a place where one could, because one was far away from the usual systems of control, experiment and try out different ways of being, identities even, including writing as a different way of being in the world. Behind the frontier was the hinterland. As a Black writer, one has to continually strategize about how to use what is intended to incapacitate you to your own advantage. Echoes in a Stranger Land grappled with issues and ideas of exile, home, and belonging as they pertain to living in Canada, a former dominion and an unsettler state. And I use that word because when we think of the word settler, you look at the dictionary, a mother settles a baby. And there is a meaning as in pacify, but I think the European has unsettled and disrupted so many areas in this world. And so I prefer to use the word unsettler state. At the time of writing, the Young Street riots, as they came to be known, were happening, sparked by the Rodney King tragedy in the US. Now, some 25 years later, as I reflect on those issues, I gaze out at the still, astonishingly blue ocean, and once again I ask myself where I truly belong, wondering whether I have gained any greater insights over the past 25 years. Labels remain, but I am now considerably older and embrace the idea that while indigenous to the world, I remain exiled, possibly permanently, since although African descended, I am not indigenous to that continent, nor am I indigenous to the Caribbean, given that my ancestors were brought into these spaces as enslaved labor after the eradication of the indigenous populations. And being immigrant to Canada, I count myself among the unbelonged there, quote unquote. Despite these facts, however, I call at least two places home. Tobago, because it continues to stop my heart with its beauty and has over the years provided a place for me to ground myself and from which to write. And Canada, because my children were born there, here, and there, here, is where I have done my life's work as a writer. Although I work always from the rock bed of the Caribbean, and in particular Tobago, the work I've done could only have been done in Canada. And although my entry to Canada was as a graduate student, I count myself among the immigrants this country has accepted. In the 70s and 80s, the remarkable Caribbean thinker Walter Rodney helped to develop the idea of being politically black, arguing that often the racist act and actor failed to discriminate in terms of his target, Pakistani, African, or Caribbean. The brute force of racism thus landed equally among peoples of color. By the 90s, however, the broad brush approach that allowed African Caribbean people, continental Africans, and Asians to gather under the rubric of being black in the political sense, particularly in the UK, had fragmented into the particularities of identities: Asian, South and East, Caribbean, continental African, and other cultural markers of identity. In the 25 years, the list of markers has rightly expanded to include LGBTQ people as well as the disabled. Back then, 25 years ago, I was reading George Lamming's The Pleasures of Exile, in which he writes, "The pleasure and paradox of my own exile is that I belong wherever I am." Now I read The Lights of Pointe Noire by Alain Mabankou, the French Congolese writer, who, on his first visit back to his home, some 25 years after leaving, observes, "I look for reasons to love this town, all smashed up though it is, and consumed by anarchic growth. Like a long-lost lover, faithful as Ulysses' dog, it reaches out its long, shapeless arms to me, and day after day shows me how deep its wounds are, as though I could cauterize them with the wave of a magic wand." Unlike Mabankou's response to his home, Tobago gives me many reasons to love it, most related to its natural beauty. But the wounds that Mabankou talks about, which are the wounds of colonialism, are present all the same, though at times better hidden. We cannot, try as we might, cauterize the wound of colonialism. It suppurates, bleeds, sometimes extrudes pus, sometimes appears healed, but aches always. On some days, however, I gaze out at the ocean, count the shades of blue, and am content, wounds and all. 25 years ago, the Young Street riots would lead to a government-sanctioned investigation by Stephen Lewis, who would identify and name the deeply systemic roots of anti-Black racism in Ontario. It would be the latest in a string of official reports on the plight of African Canadians. Then NDP Premier Bob Rae, who had commissioned the report, accepted many of the report's findings, and under his governance, Ontario saw the establishment of the Anti-Racism Secretariat. Under the subsequent Mike Harris government, Conservative government, the Secretariat was promptly disbanded, And one of the government's first actions was to permit the use of hollow point bullets by the police, despite the government publicly observing that the black community would be unhappy about this. One of those bullets would kill the unarmed First Nations man, Dudley George, in 1995 in what was known as the Ipperwash Crisis. Black communities in Canada continue to be challenged by issues of police carding of young black men and women, unfulfilled expectations, and aborted potential. Unwarranted killings by African Canadians by the police continue to plague our communities. In the passage of time, we've seen the opening to great and vocal opposition of an Afrocentric alternative primary school, which, while welcome, actually speaks to a failure of the mainstream educational system to provide a curriculum and environment that meets the needs of young African Canadian students. A subsequent attempt to start an Afrocentric high school at Oakwood Collegiate in the St. Clair-Oakwood area in 2011, the neighborhood I have lived in for the last 40 years, was greeted by great hostility by the neighborhood, despite the fact that the school has traditionally had a large number of African Canadian students. Yet another example of how African Canadians are made to feel and welcome in the city. A quarter of a century later has also seen the emergence of Black Lives Matter, the brainchild of queer and trans women from the United States, which has spawned offshoots in different cities in the US, Canada, and overseas. A response to the wanton police shootings of African American men and women, BLM's name appeared to simply state a fact at the heart of which was actually a wish, that Black lives ought to matter in the face of utter disregard on the part of law enforcers, which offends and outrages many in the Black community. It seems redundant that one has to state that Black lives matter. Indeed, in a capitalist economy, Black lives have always mattered. Unfortunately, however, not for their intrinsic value, but for their use value. The financial system we live with and in today has its roots in a system of speculative financing that was developed during the transatlantic trade in Africans. And through this system of promissory notes, it allowed for someone in Liverpool, for instance, to purchase an African in West Africa, have him or her transported to the Caribbean or the Americas for sale, and receive payment for that transaction in Liverpool. Many European nations and Europeans made their fortunes on a trade at the heart of which was the purchase and sale of Africans. This trade represents the first attempt at globalization, and it was based on black skin. It is in this sense that I say Black lives have always mattered, and it is this essential dehumanization of Black lives that generates the need for us to state today what should be redundant, that Black lives do matter for their intrinsic worth. It has been remarkable, however, how the assertion of what should really not need to be stated, that Black lives matter, becomes an irritant for so many who insist that it is exclusionary, or in response, that all lives matter, or blue lives matter. As if the very statement that Black lives matter negates the value of other lives. Is it that perhaps unconsciously those who oppose the slogan understand that acceptance of and acting on the fact that Black lives do indeed matter would shift so much that we have taken for granted that they grow uncomfortable at the possibility of such a seismic change? For make no mistake, if Black lives truly mattered, or if First Nations or Indigenous lives truly mattered, speaking of the two genocides at the heart of the unsettling of the Americas and the Caribbean, we would indeed be living in an altered universe. In those 25 years, the US did the unexpected and twice elected a biracial African-American man to be president and commander-in-chief, and then turned on a dime and elected a wealthy white businessman who appears cut from the cloth of the classic colonial governor whose stated goal is to make America great again. And my acronym is MAGA, the MAGAites. And there's a certain kind of biblical, can't you just see the MAGAites, going to build the wall? The MAGAites gathering. Those of us who come from cultures that have been riven by colonialism understand its destructive impact. Wherever they conquered and/or unsettled, colonial powers disregarded indigenous and local traditions and practice, all of which would have been centuries, if not millennia old, trampling them or forbidding them as they did the drum in Trinidad or the mbira, the musical instrument which the Shona people of Zimbabwe used to speak to their ancestors, or the potlatch in Canada, and all the other practices. People's languages and customary ways of running their lives, practicing their religions, and governing themselves was of no consequence. Custom, tradition, mores, laws were all discounted and dismantled if they got in the way of the colonial project, and more times than not, it was the colonial governor who administered these destructive practices. In his flagrant and wanton disregard of tradition, in his dismissal of long-accepted procedures and customs, in his wholesale abandonment of protocol and the established ways of governing, Trump hews closely to the role of the colonial governor who cut a wide swathe through conquered societies. Now listen to this. In 1782, among the complaints lodged against the colonial governor of Virginia, he has taken upon himself the right to preside over the body and limit debate. He states the questions and overrules in an arbitrary and threatening manner. He threatens and abuses all who speak anything contrary to his opinions. He meets privately with members and uses all of the arts of cajoling and threatening for his own ends. His behavior constitutes intolerable encroachments upon the liberties of both houses. That was 1702. All of which appear utterly familiar today. Colonized cultures and societies in Africa, Asia, the Americas, and the Caribbean all found ways to resist, but none could withstand the colonial onslaught, and they essentially either collapsed or developed dysfunctional ways of accommodating colonialism. These are the wounds Mabanku writes about. These are the wounds I witnessed in Trinidad and Tobago. These are the wounds of the First Nations and indigenous of this country live with. What is different this time is that for the first time we're actually witnessing what that process of colonial destabilization would have looked like, and that it's a white developed country that is actually going through these ravages, the results of which of the older colonialism are states that today appear always to have been this way: poor, ravaged, war-torn. In the case of the US, we're witnessing a colonial threat to a democratic culture, and this is new, although not entirely unexpected given the colonial antecedents of the US state. Consider for a macabre moment that Africa could not today support a slave trade. I insist we start from this difficult and possibly offensive place to better understand the enormity of what was done. To be able to sustain the removal of millions of healthy individuals over some 5 centuries, certain things have to be in place. There has to be potable water. There has to be the ability to grow crops to feed populations. There has to be an effective way of managing sexuality so that the group continues to replenish itself. There have to be adequate systems providing for childbirth so that infant and maternal mortality are kept at a minimum level. There has to be effective ways of training and educating the younger generation into how to live and survive in their environments. There have to be cultural systems that support people's human and spiritual needs for relationship with each other and with spiritual and religious forces. All these practices had to be in place to allow Africa to be the source of healthy people for a period of some 5 centuries. Today, as I write, there is now a famine, once again a repetition, in 3 African countries, Yemen, northern Nigeria, South Sudan, where some 4 million people are at risk of death. So I ask, what happened? I don't pretend to have the definitive answer. The answers are many and myriad. One small window for me, a philosopher whom I value quite a bit, French Jewish woman, Simone Weil, offers one that I accept. That Europe, having unsettled and uprooted itself within its own boundaries, set out around the world to unsettle and uproot others, first through colonialism, later wedded to capitalism, and later still to industrialization. Some have lived this traumatic process. Some have witnessed it. Others have turned their eyes from it. The universal result has been peoples of color being made stranger to and winnowed of their own lands, widowed of their cultures. Climate change, wars, famine, unpredictable rains, the list is endless, but it culminates in these times in our witnessing one of the largest mass movements of people fleeing those bereft lands for the Mecca of Europe and the West, as the cries mount from those places that they should go back to where they came from or stay where they are. Never mind, the West asserts. Never mind our wanderings over lands and seas to plant our flags in your countries and root out your languages and cultures to plant our own. Never mind the depredations we have inflicted. Never mind we have permanently uprooted you. Stay where you are in those very spaces that we, through our uprooting and unsettling, have made inhospitable for you. What can we do but grieve and unweep those tears with Madiba? We are now witnessing in the US a split populace facing off against each other, and it's reminiscent of those historical examples of countries like India, where different ethnic groups traditionally shared common spaces, but under colonial rule were split between Hindu and Muslim. In the US, one half of the populace, including angry, white, disenfranchised voters, having thrown their lot in with the Pied Piper of dissension, revels in a new legitimacy given to blatant racism, anti-Semitism, and Islamophobia, homophobia, and delights in banning and expulsion of immigrants and in walls erected between countries. The other half longs for that moral arc of justice that Martin Luther King spoke of. Both of these images are real aspects of the US. The upheaval in governance is the colonial onslaught writ large and taking place in a modern, developed, and technologically advanced state, the most powerful in the world. It is, I argue, a logical and predictable continuation of the colonial state now being run by a colonial governor. Indeed, states like Canada and the US and the many other countries of the Americas and the Caribbean, Australia as well, remain colonial states, most obviously in their relationship with their indigenous and African-descended populations. Whether US democracy, unlike those earlier colonized cultures, is robust enough to resist and change this newest colonial attack is now the question that faces all of us. The consequences, as we are already witnessing, will impact all of us, the world in fact, whether or not we live in the US. In 1994, 2 years after the publication of Frontiers and 4 years after the release of Mandela, the system of apartheid in South Africa began the year after my birth in 1948 would come to an end. Many of us had spent the preceding years demonstrating against the regime's practices. Its Truth and Reconciliation Commission would become a model for other war-ravaged countries such as Northern Ireland and for Canada, beginning to reckon with its barbaric past vis-a-vis its indigenous populations. I've often wondered how events may have been different if Truth and Reconciliation Commissions had been held in each and every Caribbean island as they came to independence, and in the United States after the struggle for civil rights was apparently successful. How might a public witnessing of it that which still defies naming, have changed the views of those who saw themselves as losers, those who demanded those statues erected to people like Robert E. Lee and so on should remain. Those invested in retaining systems that exploited black and brown peoples in a struggle that succeeded in bringing democracy to the US and all those tiny Caribbean islands. Colonialism has constituted a long and sustained attack against the First Nations of this country and their cultures. The establishment of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission into the Indian residential schools was, therefore, a significant, long overdue and welcome event in the course of the intervened 25 years. Its findings seem finally to awaken many unsettler Canadians to the brutal and brutalizing effects of colonialism on the Indigenous peoples of this country. A very few years after my arrival in Canada in 1968, mercury contamination at the Grassy Narrows First Nation Reserve came to the public attention. Some 50 years later, in 2017, the river remains contaminated, as are the fish that live there. Residents drink bottled water as their tap water is also unfit for drinking. The health of the members of the reservation continues to be affected by the contamination. This remains a scandal, an obscene scandal of astonishing proportions, if only because of the length of time it has taken to not solve this problem, which has been normalized. And I know that yesterday an announcement was made about, I believe, $85 million that has been set aside for cleanup of the river. And I heard the commissioner, the environmental commissioner, speaking yesterday, and she said, I may be wrong, but the government knew that she was going to be producing her report, and so that applied pressure to them to make this announcement. This continuous mercury contamination remains a tangible and ongoing example of systemic racism in this country, celebrating 150 years of colonial existence. I am reminded of the water crisis in Flint, Michigan in 2014, in which the town's water was contaminated by lead, affecting mainly lower income and African Canadians. What is clear is that in the last 25 years, racism has remained an issue, manifesting in old and new ways. The World Wide Web is now a space where the most viciously racist comments can be made with little or no consequence. The new President of the United States, number 45, has by his rhetoric opened the floodgates even further, beginning with his statements about Mexicans being rapists and Muslims being inherently terroristic, which has added fuel to an already inflammatory and racially charged situation. Casting our eyes more closely home here in Canada, we appear to have our own Trump light in Kelly Leach's test for Canadian values, and even more recently, Bill 62 from Quebec regarding women wearing the niqab and the burqa. Shame indeed. My engagement with cultural issues through writing arises not simply because I'm a writer and poet who works in the cultural sector, but because African culture was a particular focus of attack by colonial powers. Uber missionary David Livingstone was of the belief that the most effective way to bring Christianity to Africans was to first destroy their culture, then introduce commerce, then religion. He understood that culture underpinned everything. Africans were prohibited from speaking their languages, practicing their religions, playing their music. Even today, something that should be commonplace, the grooming and styling of hair, a fundamental aspect of any culture, generates a raft of responses, from acceptance through prohibition and rejection on the part of non-Africans, and great anxiety among Black women. We've been told, as I was in high school in Trinidad, that we Africans and African-descended people, unlike everyone else, in that history classroom, I recall it clearly, we had no culture or history. Even as Europe, after having stole the continent's peoples, appropriated and stole both cultural artifacts and approaches to visual art, that would lend new life to Western art. The erasure of the violent, exploitative relationship between colonizer and colonized has been woven into the ensuing relationships. The weight and influence of African music and dance continues unabated as our musical forms and styles are appropriated and taken up by different groups and peoples around the world. The sound of modernity is inextricably linked to the sound of jazz. Hip-hop, for instance, is now a multi-billion industry influencing clothing and fashion. I mention this not with a view to prohibiting anyone, it is merely an observation. Let me observe further. None of this redounds to African peoples being any more respected as they move through life. We are no more esteemed or cherished for our contributions. In the wake of the last Grammy Award ceremony, Adele, having won Album of the Year, expressed bewilderment at what Beyoncé had to do to earn one. Become white, perhaps, I thought. The question is at best naive. Adele herself has stated that in her early years as a singer in England, she would buy discarded cassette recordings of Etta James and practice trying to sound like her. Artists find their inspiration wherever they will, and I should add, I do like Adele's sound. But what continues to escape too many is that the Black singing voice in the Americas comes out of a particular and tragic history. In other words, there's a name and an address. As Lyndon Barrett, the African-American scholar, argues in Blackness and Value, Seeing Double, that voice and sound come out of a tragic history of pain, trauma, and a determination to make meaning of one's life no matter what. It is a sound lodged in a commitment to matter to and value oneself and one's community in the face of a culture that asserted that Black lives lacked meaning and were irrelevant except and insofar as they were useful to white people. The same can be said of the astonishingly innovative production, particularly in music and dance, that is found in all Afro-Sporic communities in the Americas and the Caribbean. The only new instrument developed in the 20th century has been pan, originally created in Trinidad by African-descended people out of cast-off steel drums. And the musical art forms reggae, dance hall, zouk, rumba, calypso, they have spread around the world. One of Marxism's principles that I accept is that culture and its supporting system of production are inextricably linked. Afrosporic or diasporic African cultures and their ensuing arts have existed and continue to exist in exploitative and racist systems of production. Despite this, however, Black people have continued to create value for themselves and assign meaning to their lives through their music and art. Indeed, I would say our singing and performing have been our healing, have been indeed our medicine. As all forms of cultural expression, Black cultures continue to generate apparently effortlessly. And as we healed ourselves, if only temporarily, we have continued to heal and humanize the world with our gifts, with the genius of our people. This generosity has seldom, if ever, been reciprocated. Why black, why blank, and why now? Some readers may be inclined to read the title as black, some as blank. It is both. Black, the color of the ever-expanding universe whose apparent blankness belies the plenitude of black holes, stars exploding and collapsing, planets, comets, nebulae, galaxies, red dwarfs, and red shifts, to name but a few of the bodies and events that comprise our universe. Black, the blackest version of which, known as Vanta Black, I don't know how many of you know this, was developed and licensed exclusively for use by the British sculptor Anish Kapoor in 2017. And I asked, does this mean that we can no longer be too black? Black, a word that we fled from, hiding in colored and light brown or fair-skinned in Shabin and Browning, until we embraced it in all its power. Black, a word made to do the difficult work of holding a people together in a tension-filled multiplicity. Black, that place of mystery, strength, and spirit within that often grounds me. And finally, Black, which as many readers will rightly assume, riffs on the subject matter of this work. One Black woman's attempt over time and space to grapple with and understand through writing how and why the simple and profound fact of being remains insufficient in our world. How and why being continues to be contingent on so much: race, color, gender, class, sexuality, ability, age. And how through one's life work to make a difference, however small, for the better. On board the slave ship Zong, being human was simply not enough to save enslaved Africans from being thrown overboard. That was 1781. Today in 2017, being human is still not enough to ensure survival or even equitable treatment. Consider grassy narrows. Consider Black people being shot. Consider the Rohingya Muslims, Somalis killed in the most recent bombing. Consider the people of Syria. But like the night sky whose blackness we often read as blank, which is filled with unseen and yet unexplained activity, so too are the lives of Black people, which, like the universe, are complex, multivalent, and often not understood, and often seen as blanks or ciphers onto which others project their desires, suspicions, and too often ignorance. Blank is also the metaphor that best sums up the disappeared feeling I have lived with in a writer here in Canada. Blank and Black constitute the axis around which I rotate as a writer in Canada. And here I just want to give a couple very short, I'm coming to the end, a couple short synopses of some of the cultural issues I think that are important in terms of our communities here in Toronto. Up until 1989, the areas of contestation for African Canadians had been primarily areas of policing, the justice system, education, housing, and health, areas that had direct bearing on the lives of African Canadians. In 1989, the ROM exhibit Into the Heart of Africa marked the first time the African Canadian community in Toronto would, through a series of highly charged demonstrations, challenge the mandarins of high culture over an exhibit that, we were told, was intended to be ironic, but whose impact was deeply racist. In 2016, the ROM, some 27 years after the event, which resulted in African Canadians being arrested, in 2016, the ROM issued an apology to the African Canadian community. What I was arguing 27 years ago, that the museum needed to understand the historical and contemporary needs of the Black community, is what, through the efforts of the Coalition for the Truth About Africa, happened over time and resulted in the apology. This particular engagement would then become the springboard for the showboat issue. And that galvanized the community again. In the early 90s, the production of Showboat by Garth Drabinsky and his production company Live End. Issues arose over the use of the N-word in the production, and demonstrations began against the production even as the earth was being turned for the construction of a new performance venue in North York. For an entire year, every Saturday, members of the African Canadian community demonstrated outside of what is now the Toronto Centre for the Arts during the construction of the building. And I just want to pause there and say something. You know, organizing is not quick. I'm thinking about Thabo Mbeki, who was sent overseas by the ANC. And he worked for 40 years to build a community of people who could then pressure their own countries around apartheid. And this is another example of how sometimes it's the long picture that we have to take into account. So these two events, the ROM and the Garth Drabinsky Live End production, marked a development in activism within the African Canadian community and its preparedness to engage with cultural issues. And I should just add here, Viola Desmond, though, in Nova Scotia, her challenge was to the cinema, which of course is part of the cultural scene, so I should add that here. A couple other things to mention quickly, just in terms of achievements. The Transitional Year Program, co-founded by Kieran Brathwaite to help African Canadians acquire the qualifications for entering university. It was started in the Black community in 1970, and it began as a summer program. It's now, I think, an entire program or department at U of T. Black heritage programs, which again the community had to work to get attached to the language programs which were being offered by the Toronto School Board. It's now called the International Language and African Heritage Elementary Program. The SIU, again, which came out of the Black community, its genesis lay there, and the activism of people like Charles Roach, Dudley Law, Sharona Hall, Akua Benjamin, to name but four of the people concerned. And, you know, forgive me if I don't mention all the names. Lennox Farrell, all those people have been engaged around the shootings of Black men. And this is going back 25, 30 years. That particular round of activism led to the Claire Lewis report, which in turn led to the SIU, which we know is very flawed. But it's, at least we have it. We have to then now challenge that. A couple quick comments. Caribana, the largest North American festival. And this year, I noticed it was penned in the CNE. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about that, but you know, Black bodies on the street have always presented a challenge for governments. Governments of all colors, let me add, but particularly white supremacist governments. And within that Caribana context, the ability of women to express their sexuality and free up their bodies is another aspect of this performance. And it concerns me that the festival appears no longer to be on the street, and it's now penned in the CNE. I believe this year there was no street parade, and many vendors were out there thinking that people were going to pass by, and that didn't happen. And we cannot forget the role of BLM in the 2016 Pride Parade, in stopping the parade to make demands that had direct bearing on the role of police in managing queer, Black, and trans people. And then finally, one quick comment, and all these are essays I have in this work. There's an essay I have which I think has particular relevance today. It's called Displace, the Space Between. The space between, I mean the space between a woman's legs, the space between the Black woman's legs. And what I argue in that essay is that we women, it's exhausting. That we always have to read the outer space depending on how safe we think that inner space is. Always, and in fact now with the Harvey Weinstein situation, we see that even, and usually I often thought, well, that's in terms of outer space, you're walking down a street, because what I say, when a woman says, is it safe for me to go there? She's not necessarily wondering, am I going to get my purse snatched or something? She's thinking about the space between. And in terms of Black women, the Black women were brought to the new world. Their bodies were harvested. Their offspring were harvested, Handmaid's Tale notwithstanding. They were bred like animals. And they were brought to pacify African men. And you can read these reports. They believe if they bring women, it'll make the men less inclined to run. And so there's a sense in which the Black woman's body was harvested in the same way as the outer plantation was harvested. Many, many years ago when I left the practice of law, I was of the belief that although it was necessary for us African-descended people to enter professions and other respectable jobs, it was our griots and griots, our poets, writers, dancers, musicians, and other artists who would heal us of this great tragedy of being brought unwillingly to the Americas and the Caribbean. The issue that chose me was language, and I have spent my life as a poet and writer exploring what language means for someone like myself, condemned to work in a language that commits a rape in my mouth every time I speak. I continue to be plagued by working with a language that was fatally contaminated by its history of empire and colonialism, and having no language to turn to hide. I continue to be plagued by something apparently as simple as trying to find the word to describe what is commonly referred to as the Middle Passage. That expansive ocean between there and here, then and now, before and after, between the west coast of Africa and the Americas and the Caribbean, over which our ancestors traveled, never to arrive. I have a short quote here from a writer. He's passed now, a man, and many of you might know him, will know him, Edouard Glissant. And he captures something in this. You think of the middle passage, that phrase. The first dark shadow was cast by being wrenched from their everyday familiar land, away from protecting gods and tutelary community. But that is nothing yet. Exile can be born, even when it comes as a bolt from the blue. Imagine 200 human beings crammed into a space barely capable of containing a third of them. Imagine vomit, naked flesh, swarming lice, the dead slumped, the dying crouched. Over the course of more than 2 centuries, 20-30 million people deported, worn down in a debasement more eternal than apocalypse. But that is nothing yet. The belly of this boat dissolves you, precipitates you into a non-world from which you cry out. The boat is a womb abyss. Although you are alone in this suffering, you share in the unknown with others whom you have yet to know. This boat is your womb, a matrix, and yet it expels you. This boat, pregnant with as many dead as living under the sentence of death. Is it this which made us? And what is the this? We often use the words the middle passage to describe this journey. The middle passage suggests a narrowness in contradistinction to the vast and utterly fearsome expanse of nothingness of the ocean, that immensity of water over which Sahara dust travels, to quote the lost sons and daughters of Africa in the Caribbean and the Americas. That sometimes calm and sometimes roiling water over which hurricanes travel after leaving the west coast of Africa to plague the Americas and the Caribbean. As if the ancestors, having been uprooted and troubled, continue in their restlessness to trouble us, the still so newly arrived, the never will arrive in this old, new world, quenching their thirst for us to remember and return, if only metaphorically, with the damp ocean air, only to release the pent-up liquid memory as rain and winds whistling around our ears, beating on the tin roofs a staccato call, come home, come home, come home, we miss you always. The middle passage, which some South Asians call the Kalapani, the dark water, which they crossed as indentured workers coming to the Caribbean after the emancipation, so-called emancipation of the enslaved. After 25 years, I'm still hunting, trying to find the word or words to describe the middle passage, site of so much grief and trauma, which Glissant attempts in the passage quoted above. Those words, the middle passage, don't begin to capture the experience, what the experience must have been. And sometimes I think, what was it? Was it trade? Was it kidnapping? Was it immigration, as some have suggested? Was it racial terrorism? Was it genocide? Was it ethnic cleansing? I call it the great scattering quite often. Some have named it the Maafa, a key Swahili word meaning terrible occurrence or great disaster, that which is both an end and a beginning of sorts. Poetry enables me in this difficult search and helps me to understand my own theorizing about the why, how, and what I write. I'm almost done. Perhaps translation provides the best metaphor for what we, the descendants of the Maafa, do, translating what has happened and is still happening to us into words, movement, music, painting, and sometimes joy. I want to return to the Caribbean and those ideas I mentioned early in this talk and relate them to our presence in Canada. That necklace of small coral and volcanic islands strung between the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean Sea comprises an area that has traditionally punched above its weight intellectually. Indeed, some of the foremost intellectuals of the 20th century, whose writings continue to influence us, whose writings we continue to grapple with have come from this area. Frantz Fanon, Edouard Glissant, Aimé Césaire, Sylvia Wynter, C.L.R. James, Claudia Jones, Marcus Garvey, to name a few. The list is impressive, and I haven't even mentioned the poets and novelists, Derek Walcott, Lamming. I could go on. Further, two of the islands, Cuba and Haiti, have had profound impact on the world stage, the latter being the only country in the Western Hemisphere to stage a successful slave revolt, sending shockwaves around the slaveholding world, which was virtually all of Europe. Haiti's condition today is directly related to her success in that liberation. Haiti has had to pay, I think up until the 90s, compensation to France for the slaves that were freed. Cuba, as a supporter of liberation struggles, played a seminal role in the liberation of South Africa. Cuba has also sent doctors around the world. And while they may not be part of the Anglophone community, they remain Caribbean islands despite the balkanization of imposed European languages, and display the ideals that the Caribbean diaspora has displayed in Canada and all over the world. I am Cuban and Haitian in my ideals as much as I am Trinbagonian. To be Caribbean, as Glissant argues, in Poetics of Relation, is to be there and elsewhere, rooted and open, lost in the mountains and free beneath the sea, in harmony and errantry. I add, to be black in the political sense is to be committed to a form of freedom that predates emancipation. For I argue that the enactment of various emancipation proclamations freeing enslaved Africans, which was necessary, merely caught up with what the African always knew and understood, that you cannot make of a person a thing. That there existed another form of freedom other than what was being granted by colonial powers. And how do I know that? By the countless recorded stories of Africans resisting their condition, running, fighting, revolting, setting up maroon communities, killing their children, all in consequence of a commitment to being free. I know it by the ongoing fight under different names and manifestations over time. BLM, the Black Panthers, the Garvey movement, the Black Power movement, the anti-apartheid movement, to name but a few that demonstrate the fierce, undying commitment to live in freedom with dignity and self-respect. Can one ever belong on what is essentially stolen land? And if there exists no word to describe one's state or condition in relation to where one lives, is one permanently erased? Perhaps. However, that nexus of conditions that appear to be negations, neither indigenous, migrant, nor settler, offer the potential of the blank state that, as I've argued above, belies an absence and instead contains a multitude of possibilities and potential for what Glissant calls the idea of relation, where one is rooted and open, here and there, harmony and errantry, in Africa and the Caribbean, and in Canada and the Caribbean. And he says this: people who have been to the abyss do not brag about being chosen, to the extent that the oblivion of the abyss comes to them and that consequently their memory intensifies. I reply that the abyss was an initiation for us, mapping the contours of life and death, and that we were chosen. So I have a few questions that I want to end with. Can we sit with ourselves in our grief and hold ourselves within the container of memory, knowing that we have been to the abyss and survived? Can we build a tent of relation to hold our blackness, not as a response to whiteness, but blackness in all its multiplicities and beauty, like the night sky, in all its mysteries, in all its strengths? Can we reason, as in the use of the word by our Rastafarian brothers and sisters, with our indigenous brothers and sisters? So much binds us together. We Africans were first brought by Las Casas, a good idea he thought it was, to relieve against the suffering of the indigenous in the mines of South America. The rest is history. The 5 civilized tribes held us as slaves. The Buffalo Soldiers, black men, were used to hunt them. Can we sit together, understanding how the same forces that profoundly unsettled their communities, destroying their way of life, blew us across the Atlantic to places of no forgetting and no remembering, destroying our way of life, leaving us landless and tongueless, throwing us up on the land of others. Can we sit with our Muslim and Hindu brothers and sisters, our Ifa and Vodun practicing sisters and brothers, and all the other peoples holding their wounded selves together? Can we sit together and reason and weep those unshed tears? Can we sit with our white allies and develop strategies to bring an end to white supremacy? Can we sit with our LGBTQ brothers and sisters and hold them safe from harm? Can we challenge men? This is a difficult one. Can we challenge men about their destructive role of the patriarchy and their part in holding it up? Can we hold the feet of institutions and governments at all levels to the fire to make sure that they make this society an equitable one for all? Can we? Forgive me, but I have to say, yes, we can. I love the yes, we can. We've done it before. We will. We must. I love the physical land that is Canada, as opposed to the state celebrating its sesquicentennial as a colonial state, although the promotions don't say that. I'm calmed by walking through the city's green ravines, startled by the vibrancy of fall, shocked into humility by cold, white winters. But I'm convinced that loving this land is only possible because I love the island of my birth, Tobago, that continues to transfix me all these years later. Entering the idea of Canada through the land rather than the state offers a possibility for me of being in relationship of integrity and truth with its indigenous people, since they best know and understand it. It is, after all, theirs. As I wrote 25 years ago, we belong here in these stranger lands, but belonging in its ordinary meaning implies a sense of fixity, which I don't feel. But perhaps in a world such as we live in which we have all been uprooted from ourselves, our homes, and our cultures, belonging must begin to embrace the idea of fluidity and movement, harmony and errantry, being rooted and open here and there. We face the same issues. What does it mean after 25 years, BLMT or notwithstanding, we're still facing these issues? Carl Jung's statement that what is not brought to consciousness comes to faces as fate comes to mind. Perhaps as long as racism against black folk, a practice that only occurs south of the border and not here, to hear some talk, is not brought to consciousness, in Canada at least, we are condemned to keep rehearsing its many practices. Is it that nothing has changed? Or is it, as I believe, systems change to remain the same? The election of an African American president, for instance, did not significantly improve the life of African Americans beyond the bump that one got from the fact that one very classy black couple now inhabited the White House. And there has been change in some areas. Apartheid is over. But there have been ongoing problems. But we do seem, however, to be moving back, or is it forward, to a place where there's now a greater permission to return to practices that are harmful to LGBTQ people, to women, Muslims, black and brown people, African-descended peoples, indigenous people, Latinos, Asians, even to the very world we live in. I can't sing. My mother used to tell me I didn't have a voice. But the African says if you have a voice, if you speak, you can sing. Because the phrase that came to mind as I was working on this, we who believe in freedom cannot rest. And it's a song by Ella Baker, a legendary civil rights movement. I'm not going to sing it, it's just the line I particularly love. But here's the refrain. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it comes. Until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. And if those of you who don't know, there's a wonderful a cappella group, Sweet Honey in the Rock, who sings this. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe, I'm totally out of tune, but you get the picture. And then, I'm sorry? Sing it. You want to join me? We who believe in freedom cannot rest until the killing of black men, black mothers' sons, is as important as the killing of white men, white mothers' sons. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. One last song for someone who can't sing. I am Trinidadian, also Tobagonian, and some of you may know this calypso, we jamming still. And I believe that that is not just a good time party Trini song. I think it says something about the people who continue in the face of everything. The lyrics like, the city go burn down, the treasury can fall, we jamming still. No. The city go burn down, we jamming still, we jamming still. The building could fall down, we jamming still, we jamming still. The treasury could fall down, we jamming still, we jamming still. Thank you all so much.